Welcome back to even more college football stories you may or may not have heard about. I am your host, SlimmDa Kid, and you are tuned in to a brand new You Don't Know Sports podcast. This is a part 2 to a previous podcast. Be sure to listen to part 1. Without any further hesitation, let's continue our streak of stories about college football and its craziness that follows. 1990, Colorado benefits from 2 plays. This was a pivotal season for college football that has had repercussions to this day. Colorado and Georgia Tech, yes, the Yellow Jackets, were split national champions, a controversy that helped create the Bowl Coalition in 1992, a precursor to the Bowl Alliance, BCS, and the College Football Playoff. The University of Colorado began the season 1-1-1 after losing to Illinois and tying Tennessee. The Buffaloes would eventually benefit from 2 controversial plays that resonate to this day. The first play was the 5th down against Missouri. Down 31-27, Colorado somehow received a 5th down when the referees lost track of the plays. On the extra down, Colorado quarterback Charles Johnson barely got the ball into the end zone as time expired, giving the Buffs the win. Immediately after the play, the officials realized their mistake and met to discuss what to do. After talking for 20 minutes, the referees announced the touchdown stood. Fast forward to the Orange Bowl, where Notre Dame's Rajib Ismail returned a punt 92 yards for the go-ahead touchdown. Or so it seemed. A flag was thrown for a clipping penalty, which all but ended the Irish's hopes. Colorado won the game 10-9. Meanwhile, Georgia Tech ended the year as the only undefeated team. They did tie with North Carolina and had a win over top-ranked Virginia on their resume. The Jackets would blow out Nebraska in the Citrus Bowl and ended up receiving one more vote in the coaches poll and giving them a share of the national championship. 2001, 9/11, and BCS chaos. The terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001 caused the postponement of college football games. Initially, the SEC was set to press on, announcing that their games would go on as scheduled and received instant backlash for the decision. They would ultimately postpone that weekend's games. One of those postponements would impact the chaos that ended the season. A stacked Miami of Florida football team was on a collision course to play Nebraska in the BCS championship game at the Rose Bowl. The first time since 1919 that the Rose Bowl wouldn't feature a Big Ten or then Pac-10 team. Nebraska coughed up that showdown with a loss to Colorado in the regular season finale, 62-36. Florida would ascend to the number 2 spot, but would lose to Tennessee in their rivalry that was rescheduled from the 9/11 weekend. Tennessee would end up losing to LSU in the SEC title game, which created a pool of teams, including number 2 Oregon, vying to be selected to become Miami's sacrificial lamb. The BCS computers spit out number 4 Nebraska as Miami's opponent, despite the Cornhuskers not even competing in their own conference championship. Number 3 Colorado won the Big 12 title. Miami pounded Nebraska 37-14 to win the national championship. Also, this was the first season that Florida State didn't win the ACC championship since joining the league in 1991. 2003, the time the BCS didn't work. The entire point of the Bowl Championship Series, or BCS, was to eliminate split national championships by using a ranking system to match the 2 best teams in a bowl game against each other. That system failed in 2003. USC, LSU, and Oklahoma had all lost during the season. Oklahoma lost in the Big 12 title game, which made a tense situation of which 2 teams would play for the BCS title game. USC was ranked number 1 in both the AP and coaches polls and seemed to be a lock for one of those spots. But when the BCS rankings came out, which included various computer rankings, USC was ranked 3rd behind Oklahoma and LSU. LSU would beat Oklahoma 21-14 in the Sugar Bowl to win the BCS championship. USC would beat number 4 Michigan 28-14 in the Rose Bowl, which would set up a controversy the system was supposed to control. The voters in the coaches poll were required to vote for the BCS championship game winner number 1, yet 3 voters went against protocol and gave their votes to the Trojans. LSU was named the national champion by poll. The AP poll has no requirement to do anything for the BCS and continued to vote USC as the number 1 team in the final poll, also making them national champions and creating co-national champions, which the BCS was designed to eliminate. 2005, a season of change. The biggest change occurred off the field as 18 schools changed conference membership and shook the stability of college athletics. The most notable changes were the creation of a 12-team ACC, including Boston College, and the Big East rating Conference USA, who in turn rated the Western Athletic Conference, who in turn rated the Sun Belt. This would be the catalyst for a larger change less than a decade later that would drastically change the conference landscape. Steve Spurrier was back in college coaching with a new gig at South Carolina. Urban Meyer took over at Spurrier's old gig, Florida. Charlie Weis began his Notre Dame era. There was an outstanding Heisman race as Reggie Bush and his Bush push against Notre Dame would win the trophy over Vince Young and defending winner and teammate Matt Leinart. Of course, Bush would eventually vacate the award after it was deemed he received improper benefits while at USC, only for this to be overturned years later and the award to be given back to Bush. Those 3 players treated us to arguably the greatest college football championship game of all time as Young's Texas Longhorns beat USC in a back-and-forth battle in the Rose Bowl. For once, the BCS game wasn't controversial as the 2 best teams played for the title in the best backdrop possible. We also had Penn State beating Florida State in 3 overtimes in an Orange Bowl that matched up legendary coaches Penn State's Joe Paterno and Bobby Bowden of Florida State. What could be more strange to college football than a season where everything seemingly fell into place? Even as the world of college football was changing, there was more changes to be seen behind the scenes. 2007, the curse of number 2. Before 2020, 2007 was the gold standard of crazy college football seasons. For starters, the national champion was LSU. The first time a team had lost 2 games during the regular season and somehow won the title. How? Well, there was an extraordinary amount of upsets during the season that created a void of elite teams. For example, the only BCS school to finish with 1 loss was Kansas. Yes, Rock Chalk Jayhawk, Kansas. The season started with a bang as FCS school App State went into Ann Arbor and beat the upstart Michigan Wolverines, who came in at number 5 that season, in what could possibly be the biggest upset in college football history, and it still stands to this day. That began a trend of 13 times an unranked team beat a top 10 team during the season, crushing the previous record. Notre Dame lost to both Army and Air Force that season. The curse of number 2 became a catchphrase as the number 2 ranked team would lose 7 times in the final 9 weeks of the season. Those teams included USC, the University of California, Southern Florida, Boston College, Oregon, Kansas, and West Virginia. Yep, South Florida, Boston College, and Kansas were ranked that high. 3 times during the season, the number 1 and number 2 ranked teams lost on the same day. It hadn't happened once in the prior 11 years, and it happened twice in the final 2 weeks of the season. At one point, Missouri versus Kansas was the biggest game of the season. LSU jumped 5 spots in the BCS rankings in the final week to miraculously get a spot in the national title game. The BCS Bulls looked strange as Illinois played in the Rose Bowl, Kansas in the Orange Bowl, and Hawaii was in the Sugar Bowl. In all 5 BCS Bowl games, the lower-ranked team upset the higher-ranked opponent, including LSU, ironically ranked number 2, who beat number 1 Ohio State to become the first and only 2-loss national champion. Bonus fact, we got the classic I'm 40 rant from Oklahoma State head coach Mike Gundy this season. 2011, scandals that rocked the sport. The 2011 season was more about what happened off the field than on the field. North Carolina fired Butch Davis just before the season started due to an improper benefits investigation that would eventually unearth widespread academic misconduct that rocked the entire athletic program. Ohio State was rocked by a scandal where players traded items for gifts or favors. 5 Buckeyes were suspended and head coach Jim Tressel resigned. The biggest story, however, was the Penn State Jerry Sandusky child sex abuse scandal that appalled the nation. The AD and president were charged with perjury as part of a cover-up of Sandusky's behavior while with the Penn State program. While head coach Joe Paterno wasn't found to be part of a cover-up, his inaction would ultimately cause the school to fire him on November 9th. He died of lung cancer 74 days later. We also saw the beginning of a conference realignment shakeup that would impact college athletics for years to come. Colorado and Nebraska bolted for the Big 12 and bolted from the Big 12 for the Pac-12 and Big 10 respectively. During the season, the Big 12 suffered another blow as Texas A&M and Missouri announced they would be leaving the conference for the SEC. The ACC announced that Syracuse and Pitt would also be leaving the Big East and joining the Atlantic Conference that following season. On the field, we had another version of the game of the century between number 2 Alabama and number 1 LSU. The Tigers would win that game 9-6, but would fall in the rematch in the BCS championship game, a game that helped lead to an eventual playoff system. Baylor's 50-40 win over TCU launched Robert Griffin III's Heisman Trophy winning season. 2013, airport firings, conference changes, and a kick 6. The 2013 season began with widespread changes as a massive conference realignment began with Syracuse and Pitt joining the ACC and the Big East turning into the AAC. The Western Athletic Conference, which had been around for 50 years, discontinued football. After a loss at Arizona State, USC head coach Lane Kiffin was pulled off the team bus outside the LA airport and was fired. Ed Orgeron would take over and lead the Trojans to a 6-2 finish, but Washington's Steve Sariskin accepted the permanent head coaching position, which caused Orgeron to resign and Clay Helton to take over for USC's appearance in the Las Vegas Bowl. On the field was just as crazy. Georgia Southern went into the swamp and beat Florida. Northern Illinois' Jordan Lynch set the record for rushing yards by a quarterback in a game twice by piling up 316 yards against Central Michigan and then 321 yards against Western Michigan. And then the end of the season happened. Ohio State, who had been dominant the previous year under a postseason ban, went into the Big Ten title game a win away from a BCS berth. Michigan State stunned the Buckeyes to end their hopes at a national title. And then there was Auburn. Against Georgia, the Tigers completed a 4th and 18 miracle pass for a 73-yard touchdown with 25 seconds left for what would be dubbed the prayer at Jordan Hare. 2 weeks later, Auburn would return a missed field goal attempt as time expired for a touchdown in the kick 6 against Alabama, ending the Tide's national title hopes. Auburn would earn a spot in the BCS championship game against Heisman-winning freshman Jameis Winston and his Florida State Seminoles. The two played an absolute classic. Florida State stormed back from a 21-3 deficit to take a 27-24 lead off a kickoff return for a touchdown. The two teams traded touchdowns in the final minutes, which ended with Winston's final touchdown.